Good evening and welcome to our third event on the Finance Grant Challenge Speaker Series under the leadership of Mike Faulkender here, Professor Mike Faulkender. The series is about student loan forgiveness. We had two fantastic events, and even now when I bump into students, they keep reminding me how the first one was so fascinating to hear about the federal deficit and the budget and what it can do. And the consequence of that. The second one was on crypto and digital assets, and we had a overflow room as well because there's so much interest on crypto. Today's idea, this whole idea of the speaker series came starting with our campus grant challenges initiative, or what you call the campus strategic plan, fearlessly forward. I'm going to talk about that briefly. And there are two pillars in that: reimagining learning and addressing humanities grant challenges. You know, in business school, we really don't talk about water and agricultural issues that are fundamental to human survival. But we know resources don't exist, then none of those things can happen. And those are business issues. For us, grant finance challenges, what we talk about is the exploding debt and the consequence of that on inflation, our continued spending, and what it can do to the future, especially to your generation. I think I'll retire by then, before you see the real problem. Right. One of the such issues here today we're going to talk about is the cost of higher education, the funding of the education, and what you call the student debt. And today's event, I'm going to let a very important guest we have today to talk about this particular event. So in that spirit of actually bringing these very difficult conversations, sometimes very political, how do you bring those issues to our student body to discuss these issues in a much more civil way, in a civil discourse, so that you become the thought leaders? We don't want you to be listening to our bias, but you listen to the evidence, make up your own mind. In that spirit is what the intellectual freedom, intellectual curiosity is what driving this particular speaker series. So today, to introduce our topic and to give opening remarks, we have a very special guest here today. In fact, this whole idea started with the strategic plan that Provost Rice introduced. So here we have Senior Vice President and Provost Dr. Jennifer King Rice. Provost Rice started in her role in July 2021. Under her leadership, the campus launched a fearlessly forward strategic plan in pursuit of excellence and impact for the public good. We see this strategic plan every day in everything we do. Reimagining learning. Before coming here, I took Provost Rice to see our new classrooms. Is all part of the reimagining learning as well. There's a lot of activities going on addressing humanities grant challenges, advancing public good, and investing in people and community. And that was to a large extent the brainchild of Provost Rice. Previously, Provost Rice was Dean of the College of Education, where she focused efforts to align educational resources with initiatives to advance excellence, equity, and social justice from preschool to graduate school. Provost Rice has been on the faculty and in many other leadership roles in the University of Maryland for 25 years. She's a prolific scholar, a fantastic teacher, and is recognized as University Distinguished Scholar Teacher. She was a researcher at Mathematical Policy Research in Washington, D.C., and I hear all our guest speakers also are with that briefly. Dr. Rice research draw from the disciplines of economics to study policy questions concerning excellence and equity in K-12 education systems. She has published numerous articles in leading journals. Provost Rice completed her BS in mathematics and English, a rare combination, at Marquette University, and earned her MS and PhD in Education Administration and Social Foundation at Cornell University. Please welcome Provost Jennifer King Rice to provide opening remarks.
Thank you so much, Dean Anna, for that very generous introduction and for your outstanding leadership of the Smith School and all that happens here. It is wonderful to see such strong attendance at this event to talk about such an important issue in higher education, and I would have to say in our society more broadly, given the importance of higher education to our society. So welcome. It's my privilege to be here with you all, and I'm so glad to see you all here. At the University of Maryland, as many of you know, hopefully every one of you has read that strategic plan. It's short. It's a very quick read. So hop on the web or come by my office and get a copy. But we talk a lot. We focus a lot in that plan on accelerating solutions to the grand challenges of our time. And what makes a grand challenge grand? They're grand because they're not easy to solve. They cut across disciplines. They take people to come together, bring different perspectives, different fields, to accelerate solutions, to identify pathways through them. We're committed at this university to being at the forefront of dialogue, which is what we're about tonight, and action to accelerate solutions to some of the world's most pressing problems. This third event in the Finance Grand Challenges series is a really great example of that commitment, and I'm really grateful that the Smith School is taking this on. As former dean of the College of Education and now provost of the university, I really truly understand the vital role that universities like ours play in training the next generation of leaders. One of the most important ways that we can continue to do that is by finding ways to make pursuing higher education a more affordable and a more accessible option to any student who chooses that path, so that a student's financial situation is not the determining factor in their future pursuits and their future opportunities. Fortunately, with great assistance from our legislature here in Maryland, we at the University of Maryland have been able to keep tuition increases lower than in most states without sacrificing quality. And as part of our strategic commitment, one of our four strategic commitments is to invest in people and communities. As part of that commitment, we've made significant institutional investments to support our most financially vulnerable students and, maybe more importantly, prospective students. Our Terrapin Commitment Program, announced just last year as the largest single-year investment in needs-based scholarship in our university's history, is designed to do exactly that, to help ensure that a University of Maryland education is accessible and affordable to every Maryland student. However, many students around the country don't have these opportunities, don't have these same options and this kind of support. And this is potentially a consequence not just for those individuals, but to society, given the externalities and spillover effects of higher education. So today's discussion is going to focus on another policy alternative being advanced to solve the grand challenge of college access and affordability: student loan forgiveness. We hear it in the news all the time, ups and downs, back and forths. Leading today's discussion is Dr. Michael Faulkender, the Dean's Professor of Finance here at the Smith School. After joining the University of Maryland in 2008, he became Associate Dean of Master's Programs in 2017, and I believe that's when we met, right? We were on the Associate Dean's Council together. Dr. Faulkender stepped down from that role at the beginning of 2019 to join the U.S. Department of Treasury, serving as Assistant Secretary of Economic Policy. In that role, he advised the Secretary on domestic and international issues that impacted the economy. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, he assisted in negotiating the CARES Act and was the senior Treasury official who led the implementation of the Paycheck Protection Program, an enormous challenge that saved many small businesses. In January 2021, he was awarded the Alexander Hamilton Award for Distinguished Leadership, the highest service award granted at the Department of the Treasury. Dr. Faulkender's research lies at the intersection of financial economics and public policy, and his work has been published in top academic finance journals, received numerous best paper awards, and has been featured in a number of popular presses, including Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, New York Times, and so forth. In the last 2 years, he's testified to Congress 7 times. He is the epitome of what I frequently talk about, of public education having a public impact, a real world impact. And so I thank you for that. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Faulkender.
Thank you, Provost Rice, for attending this evening, for those warm remarks by both the Dean and the Provost. It's been a privilege working with you, and I remember those days on the Associate Dean Council. So thank you for joining us. I want to welcome all of you to tonight's event, and in particular, I want to have help me welcome our guests this evening, Sandy Baum and Diane Jones. Sandy is a non-resident senior fellow at the Urban Institute and a professor emerita of economics at Skidmore College. Dr. Baum earned her bachelor's degree in sociology at Bryn Mawr College, where she served on the Board of Trustees between 2012 and 2022, and her PhD in economics at Columbia University. She has written and spoken extensively on issues relating to college access, college pricing, student aid policy, student debt affordability, and other aspects of higher education finance. Dr. Baum co-authored the College Board's annual publication Trend in Student Aid and Trends in College Pricing from 2002 through 2019. She's published numerous articles on higher education finance in professional journals, books, and the trade press. And she's principal researcher on the Urban Institute's websites on college affordability and state grant aid. And her recent work includes briefs on state grant programs, institutional accountability, funding short-term certificate study, and non-tuition expenses. Our second guest this evening is Diane Jones. Diane has served in senior roles in higher education, government, the private sector, and at nonprofit organizations. Her experience includes teaching and administration at the Community College of Baltimore County, the former University of Maryland Center for Marine Biotechnology, Princeton University, and the Career Education Corporation. She's held science and education policy positions at the National Science Foundation, the House of Representatives Committee on Science, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, the Department of Labor, and the Department of Education. She served as the Assistant Secretary for Post-Secondary Education during the Bush administration and the Acting Undersecretary of Education during the Trump administration. In both roles, she oversaw the development and implementation of federal higher education policy, including federal student aid policy, and also served as the Senior Department official for accrediting agency recognition. So you can see how blessed we are this evening to have two such experts in this topic. Thank you for joining us this evening. Before we kick things off and have them give some opening thoughts on student loan forgiveness, I just want to give some background information for those of you that are maybe a little bit less familiar with this topic. And of course, in the process, I can't forgive myself for not getting up and giving a little bit of a lecture, right? The econ faculty and the finance professor, and he just feels the need to always do that. So let me start with just some information for you. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, if you look at what has happened to tuition costs in the last okay, I'll just give it to you by words. If you look at college tuition and fees across 2-year, 4-year institutions, as well as graduate schools, they have risen an average of about 6.25% per year between 1980 and 2023. That compares to the broader consumer price index of all goods and services that's risen about 3.1% over that same time period on an average year. Now, I know almost all of you have taken finance in this room. So if we think about compounding that differential over that 43-year time period, what that means is that while the average good or service has increased 268% over that 43-year time period, college tuition has risen 1,244%. As a result, more and more students and their families are seeking financial assistance to attend college. According to the Congressional Budget Office, between 1995 and 2017, the balance of outstanding federal student aid increased 7-fold from just under $200 billion to now to $1.4 trillion in 2017. As of March of 2023, that stands at $1.65 trillion. Some of this is because a higher percentage of high school student graduates are attending post-secondary institutions. Some of it is coming from changes in federal student loan options. And of course, much of it is coming from the fact that tuition has been rising. That said, college attainment continues to be strongly correlated with employment and income results. So as we've seen from this information from the Bureau of Labor Statistics for 2022, those with a high school diploma have median weekly earnings of just $853 compared to those with a bachelor's degree of $1,432, and those with professional graduate degree at median weekly income of $2,080. When we look at differential unemployment rates, those with a high school diploma, it was 4% compared to 2.2% for those with a bachelor's degree and 1.4% for those with a professional degree. So on average, it continues to be the case that higher education more than pays for itself. However, not all employment outcomes are the same for all who attend school. STEM fields tend to have higher initial incomes after graduation than average non-STEM fields. In his book, Is College Worth It? A Comprehensive Return on Investment Analysis, Preston Cooper estimated that approximately 28% of programs have a negative expected return on investment. Likewise, and perhaps more important, not everybody who starts a college program finishes it, but nevertheless, they take on the tuition burden from it, even though they don't see an increase in income as a result of only partially attending. And unlike other forms of debt, student loan debt is not currently dischargeable in bankruptcy. One reason that student loan forgiveness has garnered so much attention is because millennials, those born between 1981 and 1996, seem to be behind on a number of economic and household formation statistics. According to Pew Research Center, millennials are, quote, delaying or foregoing marriage and have somewhat slower in forming their own households. They're more likely to be living at home with their parents and living there longer, end quote. To address this issue, the Biden administration has been looking for ways to forgive federal student loans, initially announcing up to $20,000 of forgiveness to Pell Grant recipients. This action has run into some difficulties in the courts, but other forgiveness activities continue, one of them being, for instance, a reevaluation of what's known as income-driven repayment, or IDR. Historically, the way that IDR programs have worked is that borrowers have maximum payments up to 150% up to 10% of the portion of their income that's above 150% of the poverty line. One of the proposals is to raise that to 225% of the poverty line and then cap it at 5% of the earnings amount above that. However, that could be particularly expensive. Penn Wharton, for instance, has estimated that student loan forgiveness could ultimately cost the federal government hundreds of billions of dollars at a time that we're running massive budget deficits. Before I get into solutions, and this is where the finance professor is going to do a little bit of lecturing, let's first talk about why student loans are different than any other kind of loan. Because of course, we often hear, how is this different than a car loan or a mortgage loan? And one of the most important differences is that student loan borrowers, of course, have no credit histories yet. You know, they're 17, 18, 19 years old when they're getting their first undergraduate loan, and they don't have credit histories. In addition, there's no collateral that they can post against that borrowing. So in that way, it's very different from a car loan or a mortgage loan. What that means is that there may be no interest rate at which a lender is willing to lend to them. This is something that those of you who have taken economics classes understand is a form of adverse selection. That form of market failure therefore potentially generates a unique role for government intervention that doesn't exist in other kinds of borrowing, right? And so one of the things we'll talk about is, as the government has intervened in this program, how do we do so in a way that addresses potentially this adverse selection without creating some perverse incentive issues, what we would call moral hazard? So some of the questions we're going to explore tonight about forgiveness include the current federal deficits that our nation is already incurring, whether it's fair to provide relief to those who are likely to have higher lifetime incomes, and what about those who have already paid off their loans or who worked their way through school. At the same time, college costs have grown at such a fast rate, many families are struggling, and so isn't there something we can do to relieve some of that burden? So those are some of the questions we're going to discuss this evening, and with that, I'd like to hand it over to Sandy to talk about some of her initial thoughts on the topic. And so you can show clicker.
Thank you. And it works now?
It works now.
Good. Okay, so student loan debt is obviously something that people have heard about and read about, and the idea of forgiveness. I think the conversation tends to be very emotional, and so it's good to take a step back and have this opportunity to talk about some of the facts behind it. So I just wanted to share a couple of pieces of information, and of course, we're going to talk more later. We just talked about the level of outstanding student debt. Ever since the amount of debt outstanding passed $1 trillion, that's been the favorite statistic. Before that, people focused much more on how much do individual students owe, which is of course much more significant, because what you're really worried about is, are people borrowing so much money that it doesn't work for them and it ruins their lives to pay it back. This is a graph of outstanding student debt over time adjusted for inflation. And no one talks about this. I mean, the amount of outstanding student debt has actually leveled off even before you adjust for inflation, and in the last few years has fallen in real terms. And if you think about, so it's not on a totally upward trend. It was increasing much more rapidly before. But anytime somebody borrows $1 and nobody pays back $1, you know, the outstanding debt is going to increase. And we just had this period of time where nobody had to pay their student loans, because during the pandemic, you didn't have to, but people were still taking student loans. But most important, so I think the fact that it's not just going up to the sky is important, but most important is that what really matters is how much individual students borrow and exit, okay, and who it is who has the debt. So when we think about, there are students who have borrowers with real problems and we have to do something about it. So I don't in any way want to suggest that there's no problem and that we shouldn't have this as a public policy issue. But we should think about who has debt, who's making the payments, who would benefit from student debt forgiveness. And one thing is that as a solution to college access and affordability, it's not really very helpful, because people are, if you forgave all the debt that's outstanding today, the people going to college next year would still have to borrow money, right? So this is not about access. This is about people who've already had their education. Who has these loans? It turns out that most of the debt is held by people with relatively high incomes. So the bottom bar here is the share of outstanding debt by quintiles of household income. And on the upper half of the graph, on the right-hand side of the graph, you can see that about 60% of the debt is held by people in the top 40% of households. And the people at the bottom, they don't have very much student debt. Why is that? Because they didn't go to college, or if they did, they went for maybe a year. And the reason they have low incomes is because they don't have much post-secondary education. So it's not like the poor people who are the people with a lot of student debt. It's actually people higher up in the income distribution. And the top bar here just looks at the monthly payment amounts. And the monthly payments are even more concentrated among high income people, because we have all these people in income driven repayment where you have higher payments if you have a higher income. So when we stopped those payments during the pandemic, it was really helpful to the people with high incomes, most of whom were working at home virtually and actually not having a problem repaying their loans. So that's really important. This is not really a good anti-poverty policy. And again, we want to know how much individual students are borrowing. And the total amount that people are borrowing every year has been going down since 2010. This is a graph of the average debt of people who graduate with bachelor's degrees. And the blue bars are public 4-year, the orange bars are private nonprofit 4-year, the gray bars mix them together. And what you can see is that actually in 2021-22, the average debt of graduates, again adjusted for inflation, was lower than it had been 5 years earlier. Now, over time, it's certainly gone up. I mean, you know, like 30 years ago, people didn't borrow nearly as much money as they do now. This also doesn't include people who attend for-profit institutions, who borrow much more money than those who go to public and private nonprofit institutions. But still, the point is not that students aren't borrowing a lot. Some students are borrowing huge amounts of money, but it's not going up, up, up. And that should be something of a comfort. It's not like, let's project it to the future and see the disaster. And then, you know, what I said about affluent, relatively affluent people holding the student debt, this is a little bit complicated graph to see, but this graphs both the borrowers are in blue and the debt is in orange. And at the top, you have people who owe $200,000 or more, and then $100,000 or more. And it's not very many people, but it's a huge share of the debt. So the 7% of borrowers who owe $100,000 or more, only 7%. You'd think from the newspapers, everybody owes $100,000, right? 7% of borrowers. And they hold almost 40% of the debt, and they went to graduate school, because you can't borrow that much from the federal government if you don't go to graduate school. But then at the bottom what you have is a third of the borrowers who owe less than $10,000. They hold a tiny share of the debt. So if we are worried about those people, we could get rid of that debt and it wouldn't be very expensive. But if you forgave all the debt or $50,000 of debt, you'd really be going to that small number of people who went to graduate school and have all that debt. These people at the bottom, I think, are important because there's this new income-driven repayment plan that is, I think, overly generous. One of the good things about it, people tend to say it's good or it's bad, is that if you borrowed a little bit, if you borrowed less than $12,000, you don't have to wait 20 years to have it forgiven. If you pay it back for 10 years, then you can start getting it forgiven if you borrow just a little bit. So the way the system works now, doesn't matter how much you borrow, you pay the same payments, you pay for the same amount of time based on your income. And so this is good. These people, you go to school for a year, you borrow $5,000, you end up with a minimum wage job. We don't have to keep you paying for 20 years. But many, many people go to graduate school and borrow. You can borrow a pretty infinite amount of money if you go to graduate school. And almost half of the federal student loans are going to graduate students now. So the public conversation doesn't take that into consideration much. The image is that it's all for undergraduate school, but a huge share of it is for graduate school. So I think we really have to think about some of these realities. There are groups of people who are really struggling, people who drop out of college, a lot of people who went to for-profit colleges. And there's a real racial issue here because Black students borrow much more than other students. And that would include Hispanic, Latino students. Black students borrow more. They have more trouble paying it back. We have a real racial wealth gap problem. We need to address it. But student debt is not going to be the way we solve that huge social problem.
Thank you, Sam.
One interesting fact is, so I was at the department when we put loan payments on pause. And what was really interesting is up until the time that the administration ended, we had about 14% of the borrowers that continued to make their student loan payments. And they really took away some of their principal because there was no interest accumulating. So we had about 14% of the borrowers. We were receiving about 50% of the amount of revenue. It didn't go to the department, it went to Treasury. But so even when it was on pause, those higher borrowers did keep their jobs and they did continue to make payments and they did pay down principal until they started hearing about loan forgiveness. And then everybody stopped because why would you keep paying if it might be forgiven? So I'm going to talk really fast and because I want to get to the Q&A. So if I say something and it makes no sense during the Q&A, you can circle back and ask, but I talk really fast because I've worked in this area for decades and I'm really passionate about it, as is Sandy. So it's kind of hard to limit the remarks. I focus a lot on the risk in the program. So having been a former federal official, you think about the risk. And I certainly think about student risk, but in my former job, until I retired, I had to think about risk to the federal fisc. And there are a few problems with the current situation. One is we don't have indicators that accurately assess program risk. Cohort default rates are what we use to monitor, which is, how many people default on their loan in the first 3 years. That is not a good indicator for a couple of reasons. One, parent plus loans are not considered in cohort default rates. And many schools have gotten smart. They've pushed the debt onto the parents because if the parents default, it does not show up in the cohort default rate. Two, elite private schools tend to have students who default later and on much larger balances. So the elite private schools, they tend to have higher default rates in years 5, 7, and 10 when parents stop repaying loans on behalf of students. And when they do default, it's on huge amounts. But that doesn't get captured in the figures because cohort default rate is 3 years after graduation. And really, defaulted loans are not the problem because for the most part, defaulted loans get collected on, and the ones that get collected on, they double the amount they owe. The real risk to the portfolio, as both have alluded to, is income-driven repayment. So in today's world, cohort default rates don't really tell you about the risk. And in fact, that $1.6 trillion portfolio is estimated to have a value of $600 billion. So the second is, there's focusing on borrowing averages. And I think it's important to monitor borrowing averages, but I think it sort of masks the truth because those figures tend to track how much students are borrowing. And again, a lot of that borrowing has been pushed off to parents. And so we don't really know how much is being borrowed when parents are doing a lot of the borrowing. And some of those statistics include non-borrowers. Well, guess what? Rich kids who don't take loans don't have to worry about debt. So including them in averages is very misleading because it understates. And I think Sandy mentioned this in a paper in like '85. She brought up the issue that, if you include the people who don't borrow, you're going to get a very different outcome. And then third, completion rates are an indicator we follow, but completion rates actually tell you much more about admission selectivity and student demographics than they do about anything else. So it's important to monitor these indicators over time. Big shifts tell you something is wrong, but in and of themselves, they're not all that helpful. There are some fundamental flaws in the current reform efforts. I think I left something off my slide. So the current reform efforts, a lot of times, we see publication or even penalties for schools that increase tuition too quickly. Well, some schools push the cost into housing so that they can kind of hide it somewhere. Public colleges have done a really good job of keeping tuition increases low for in-state borrowers. According to the Diamondback, you only accept 44% of Maryland applicants to the college. So for those lucky enough to get in, great. For those not, they can get in a good school if they go out of state because they're going to pay private school tuition, and international students do the same. So when you follow the cost of public education, it's based on in-state tuition. Michigan has a cap at 35%. They will not accept more than 35% of the students from the state of Michigan. I think this is one of the biggest problems in the program right now, is people are forced to go out of state to get into the flagship because they're qualified, but the flagships really favor those international students and out-of-state students, and who can blame them? They pay 3 or 4 times as much. There are other reform efforts that there are lots of ways that people have tried to, change the trajectory. One of them was putting, borrowing limits, or at least putting some credit criteria in place. So President Obama did a very good thing. He said, parents are really digging themselves into debt. I'm going to put credit criteria in place so that parents can't dig themselves into debt. He was pummeled about the head and neck, and he had to reverse that policy because the parents want the money on the front end. They just don't want to pay it back on the back end. So the reform efforts, here they come. Okay, so the publishing program earnings, this one is also a really difficult, it's difficult to look at because A, different programs have different level of earnings. B, many non-traditional students choose to work part-time, not full-time. So when you have a school that serves lots of non-traditional students, their earnings are going to be artificially low because many people can't afford daycare, so they just work on the weekends when somebody else can watch the kids. So you get this skewing. And along those lines, a lot of the talking heads in DC say, well, publish the earnings and then the students will make better decisions. As if students are the ones in control of choice. They are not. The colleges decide who gets to go, and the colleges decide who gets to be in a high payoff major. 90,000 qualified nursing applicants are denied admission every year. Our nursing shortage is not a lack of interest. So all the talking heads that say, go into nursing, great, but if you're the 90,000 people who don't get in, you've spent 2 years in college, and what are you going to do with it? So there's a problem with that. And many of the high payoff fields require skills that many college students don't have, math. So, that's a problem as well. And then I already talked about the debt limits. What compels students and parents to overspend? There are no do-overs, right? So here's the analogy I use. You are told at 18, go buy your first car, And based on that car that you bought, that's the best car you're ever going to have in your whole life. So you make a choice at 18 that limits your buying power for the rest of your life. You might be compelled to go buy that Porsche, even if you're going to crash it, even if it's going to get repossessed, if somebody gives you a loan to do it, because you don't want to cut off the ability later in life to have a better car. That's what has happened in higher education. There's so much value placed not on just if you went to college, but where you went to college. People live in fear, especially parents live in fear that if I don't pay all this money for my kid to go to the biggest name school they can get into, they might lose out on opportunities in the future, and it might be my fault. There's a lot of fear. And then secondly, and this is not necessarily the fault of colleges, this is the fault of students. Colleges are increasingly selling a lifestyle, an experience, and I'm not just talking about lazy rivers. Beautiful buildings on campus, nice dorms, travel abroad. All of these things cost money. And some colleges, I worked at Princeton, they paid a fortune to have product placement in movies so that everybody would want to go there. So students want the amenities. And in fact, there was a survey done last year of low-income high school seniors saying, if you could pick between a low-cost school with fewer amenities, but higher cost and more amenities, what would you pick? Majority picked higher amenities. It's a generational thing, you know. This is what I think the problem is. So national averages don't tell the personal story. And Sandy is absolutely right. This applies to people who went to grad school. But people who went to grad school are more vocal, and a lot of them work in Washington, D.C. So you see an overrepresentation in Washington, D.C. of these people. But here's the issue. And I am not an economist, so I'm using ballpark numbers here. So for all of you doing your back of the envelope calculations, this is ballpark, and I'm only looking at grad plus loans. You're a graduate student for 4 years. You borrow $30,000 a year, which is not a lot of borrowing for graduate students. At the end of 4 years, you enter repayment. You owe $120,000 in principal, and the day you go into repayment, you also owe $24,000 more in capitalized interest. You are now paying your loan on a total of $144,000 instead of $120,000. Your monthly payment for 30 years, you get automatically put in a 30-year plan. Your monthly payment is $1,000 a month, $900 of which for the first 10 years go for interest. 10 years later, you've been paying on your loan, you've paid $120,000, you look at your principal and you owe $126,000, and you think, holy crap, that's more than I borrowed. This is the problem. This is why people complain. This is why students want loan forgiveness. The program is a total ripoff when it comes to interest and fees. And I do not believe we should ever forgive principal. You took it, you spent it. But interest is a problem. Why should a poor kid pay 3 times as much to go to college as a rich kid? This, in my mind, is the fundamental problem. And so I think we should be talking about interest. Congress will never lower the interest rate because if they do, they have to pay for it. It looks really expensive. And so they increase the interest rate because then they can use that money to buy other things. At the end of the day, this borrower over 30 years pays $380,000. That is a house. So if your policy objective is more home ownership, you have to forgive loans. These are the people buying houses. I'm not saying you should. I completely agree with Sandy. These are the people that have economic buying power, but they're paying so much on their student loans. They might not be able to buy a house. They could otherwise. And by the way, they're going to still be paying on their loans when their kids are in college, which, you know, you have a compounding problem. So if your goal is home ownership, you got to target these people. The undergraduate who owes $12,000 has a $128 a month payment. If they can't make it, they ain't buying a house. Now, those are the people who are struggling. Most of them probably only went to college for 1 year, and it might have been because a president said every American should have 1 year of college. So I think forgiving the loans of that group is an important thing to do, but that is not going to change home ownership and delaying marriage and all the other things. So you have to figure out what your policy objective is. I argue that the federal government owes most borrowers at least $5,000 in a refund because for years, the federal government improperly capitalized interest when there was not a law or regulation that required them to. We caught it and eventually it got reversed for new borrowers, but so I think this is the problem. The problem is the program is a total ripoff. The interest rates are high. When the rest of the world has low interest rates, yours doesn't change. You can't refinance. I think this is the crux of the issue. And I think people don't complain about paying principal. And as long as you don't forgive principal, you're not hurting people who paid their way through or, who went to a less expensive school because it costs, if you forgive principal, it's unfair. If you make interest reasonable. And so I think it is reasonable to do what they do in Scandinavian countries, which is we're going to give you as many years as it takes to pay it back, but you will never pay more than 150% of what you borrowed. That is the way to solve the problem that I think is fair to everybody, including non-borrowers. But maybe I'm wrong. I'm going to really quickly go through the history because I think there were some pivotal moments in the last 50 years that got us to where we are. I'm going to go really fast, but we can come back during Q&A. 1958, National Defense Education Act, the first real student loans went to STEM majors, went to foreign language majors. For 30 years of my career, most of the people who led universities or government agencies had gone to college or graduate school with an NDEA loan and credited it for their entire future success. And they thought, we got to have more people getting loans. This is the ticket to success. I did not have an NDEA loan. I had a student loan. I felt the same way for the first 20 years of my career. I was a first-generation college student. My mom was a single parent, could have never gone to college or graduate school without loans. It changed my life. I used to think, if everybody could borrow, it would change everybody's life. I don't think that way anymore, but I used to. 1965, we have the Higher Ed Act. Its primary goal, expand campus infrastructure and libraries, increase faculty workforce, check, check, expand access to minority students, check minus. 50 years later, we're not there yet. 1972, pivotal decision to add gainful employment programs to the program. For-profit institutions, as well as non-degree programs at colleges and universities. Huge mistake. Those are different programs. They serve different kinds of students. They should get some assistance, but in a different program. Why did they do that in 1972? Vietnam vets had the highest utilization rate of their GI Bill benefits, and guess what? Traditional colleges didn't want them. When you came home from Vietnam, nobody stood in the airport and clapped for you. Nobody thanked you for your service. Nobody welcomed you onto campus. Those schools had to be added to absorb all of those people who had earned the benefit and wanted to use it. They should have done it differently. It was a big mistake, but they did. So in the beginning, I think the motivations were mostly noble. Then we get to the 80s and panic sets in because now we have student loan default rates, correct me if I'm wrong, in the 30% range. And we have dark sky predictions for enrollment. I was born in 1964. I'm the end of the boomers. I finished college in 86. We were done, right? And so higher ed leaders were looking at demographic trends saying, oh my God, there aren't very many high school graduates coming our way. What are we going to do? Aha, we're going to go to non-traditional students and older students and try to bring them back. Guess what? They borrow more, they're higher risk. So we're trying to bring in riskier students at the same time that Congress is afraid that this program is a bad economic investment. So what does higher ed do? It becomes an industry. And I'm not sure which is cause and which is effect. But in 1992, there were amendments to the Higher Ed Act that turned the federal student aid program from a need-based program to an entitlement program. If you can fog a mirror, you can get a loan. And once you have an entitlement program, an industry will grow up around it, and higher ed did. And this is when schools got their first onboard lobbyists. And I can't remember what it says there. Okay. So you get this entitlement program. So, colleges see opportunity. President Clinton created a new loan program, the direct loan program, with noble ambition. He was right to do it. The lenders were not doing right by low-income students. And so the government needed to step in. Totally agree. I feel differently in the current iteration, but he was right. Here's the big mistake. The master promissory note was authorized by Congress. Here's the deal. You sign once for a loan, and your school can give you 9 more without you signing a single piece of paper. And you might not know you got a loan because your school might put it in a financial aid letter where you think it was a grant. And you don't know you took a loan until you graduated. I met thousands of students who were in this position. Moreover, I don't think these loans are enforceable because the Department of Ed does not have a signature on file for most of these loans. They've been bought and sold so many times, the original paperwork is missing. And when electronic signatures were new, there was no fingerprint for the electronic signature. I think these loans are unenforceable, many of them. I think the master promissory note was the biggest mistake. Students can dig in without knowing about it. This is a problem. Why do we do it? Because the school financial aid officers did not like having a line at their door every year trying to get students to sign their forms. This was a big deal. 2002, the big payoff, Jennifer Cheeseman's report from Census, great report, talks about, you know, the earning benefit of college, but is very clear to say, but it depends on your major and your personality and where you live and your ambition and your work-life balance. None of that gets picked up. The headline is, you make, say it with me, $1 million more by going to college. Sandy published her first education page report. Again, excellent report, disaggregated data, tells the true story. Talking heads pick up one fact. Go to college, you'll make more. Don't worry about taking a loan. You're going to be able to pay it back. Next big mistake, 2006, the 50% rule was eliminated. So prior to 2006, an online university could only grow as fast as their ground-based university. There were natural constraints in place. In 2006, my predecessor in the Bush administration eliminated that rule. We can talk about that later, whether it was good or not. That's why University of Phoenix used to have, you know, their name on a sign on every highway exit because they could only grow online, and UMUC isn't much better. I know they're not called that anymore. So, but this rule changes, and now you can grow online as fast as possible. And then a year later, we go into one of the biggest recessions we've ever had. There's panic. Now there's an opportunity because students, when enrollments in college are counter-cyclical with the economy. When the economy is good, people don't go to school. When the economy is bad, they do. So we changed this rule. Online institutions have unlimited power to enroll students, and we have huge numbers of people looking for something to do. Then there's panic. In 2007, the put loan program. So I'm on the train one morning. I get a call from Hank Paulson's office. He says, Diane, you know, the first slabs that failed at auction. I'm like, I have no idea what a slab is. Student loan asset-backed security. I'm like, okay, do tell. The student loans failed at auction. It was just like the mortgage crisis. We realized we had to buy loans from the private lenders to free up cash so they could make loans for the next year. This is when the federal government bought lots and lots of private loans, didn't know how to service them, brought in contract servicers, and we ended up with 9 contract servicers, each with their own software, their own computer systems. They own the data. The Department of Education doesn't have data. Every time we get a data call from Congress, you got to go to all of the servicers. They own the data. This is a big, big problem. In many ways, the beginning of the end, I think. And then we get to the point where the loan program was weaponized. And both parties have weaponized it because they each pick winners and losers. They pick different ones, right? 2008, Obama says everybody should go to 1 year of college. And even more than that, he requires unemployment offices to send letters to every unemployment recipient to say, hey, guess what? If you go to college, you can get a student loan and it'll generate cash. A lot of people did. And a lot of the for-profits took advantage of that enrollment surge, and they got themselves into a load of trouble because they didn't have administrative controls in place. Obama eventually corrected that position once people told him what happens when you go to 1 year of college. Then we have the Affordable Care Act. Guess what, folks? The Affordable Care Act, that health insurance everybody talked about, the reason they could pay for it is because somebody told them that your student loan payments were going to generate $45 billion over 10 years, which is what was spent to expand health insurance and expand Pell Grants. That didn't really happen. So now the federal government is the only lender, and they call the portfolio an asset, and maybe it was. But then Congress authorizes pay as you earn, the second of the big income-based repayment programs. It was legal. Congress did it. They found a way to pay for it. Then the administration illegally used regulatory authority to create the repay program. Illegal because an agency cannot use regulatory authority to create a program for which Congress has not made an authorization. They lied. The department says, oh, this is a no-cost program. Total lie. The asset's now a liability. It's now a $45 billion liability, not an asset. Then, people go to then borrower defense is weaponized, and you get, schools are shut down and every single borrower's loan is forgiven, maybe deservedly, maybe not. Not 2019, student loan forgiveness is the campaign promise heard around the world. 2024, the SAVE program, which also is illegal because it's not cost neutral. So the student loan program, it really took a downturn under President Bush. I was there. Both sides have been involved. So the program really took a turn for the worse in 2007 under Bush's watch because of the housing crisis, and it's gotten worse ever since. So I'm not going to talk about this, but I am going to get to my cartoon. That has Parent Plus loans. I'll come clean.
So let me give a little bit of a background, and then I want to get some thoughts from Sandy on Diane's presentation. Just for kind of edification for everybody again in the audience, there's essentially 3 different types of loan programs. So there's the undergraduate loan programs, which, correct me if I'm wrong, are capped at $7,500 a year, right?
It goes up over
Goes up
time.
over inflation.
And it depends if you're independent, but the total cap, I think, is 52,000 now, or 51,000 if you're dependent, and 52 if you're independent.
Okay. Whereas then there's graduate plus loans, and that's based upon cost of attendance. And then third, there's parent plus loans that are extended to parents to supplement. So we cap how much can go to the undergraduate borrower, but if they still need more, the parent can borrow, right? So we want to think about those 3 populations differently, because again, the income streams that are available to them, their ability to pay, but also again, back to that adverse selection, how much do we not know about the borrower? That's different at 18 versus at 22 versus at 15. Okay, so, but Sandy, I think we heard from Diane that a lot of at least what I gleaned from it is that a lot of the increase in cost of tuition was perhaps facilitated by access to the federal student loan program. I wanted to get your thoughts on, what Diane's view was on that, or why has college education gone up so much? Because as we start to think about solutions that should accompany any forgiveness, let's first identify why it's gone up.
Well, first, one thing is that when students borrow, they're not just borrowing to pay their tuition and fees. They're borrowing to pay their living expenses. There are many, many students who have their tuition and fees covered by grant aid. If you're a low-income student, you're going to a public institution, and your state has a good grant program, and you have a Pell Grant. So, and you look at the debt amounts of people who aren't paying tuition, they're not that far below the debt amounts of the people who are paying tuition. So even if college were free, we'd still have a lot of student loans. And so it's not correct that increases in tuition are even necessarily the driving factor, because they obviously matter. Obviously, the more your whole bill is, the more you're going to have to come up with money. Grant aid has increased over time quite considerably, but certainly not enough to pay for people's living expenses. So why does college tuition keep going up? There are a lot of complicated reasons at public institutions. If you look at nationally, what's happening is more and more people are going to college, and state funding simply hasn't increased rapidly enough to maintain funding per student. It goes up and down. It's cyclical. When states don't have any money because it's a recession, then they cut back. Where can you cut? You cut on by not giving the colleges so much, and they raise their tuition. And you can do a graph and you see everything moving in opposite directions of how fast is tuition going up and what's happening to state appropriations. Private colleges, obviously, that's not the issue. But if you look over time, what you see is one thing is if you think about why prices don't go up as rapidly in some industries, they increase productivity, right? We have technology that makes individual workers be able to produce more and more and more. And then look around at your college campus and think, okay, how are we going to make the faculty more productive, you know? And it means we can have more students sitting in the classroom. We can make them teach more classes and have less time to prepare their classes and to do their research. But as in other kinds of industries where you have a certain number of people to produce the output, it's much harder to maintain productivity. And faculty have to have real wage increases also. And it's not that faculty are being paid, you know, huge amounts of money, certainly relative to people with similar levels of education. Colleges, of course, doing many more things than they used to do. I mean, there are all kinds of offices on campus that didn't used to exist that have, some of them are very valuable, like student support systems, academic support systems. We have many more students who need special services than used to be the case, and we recognize those special services. But then there also, of course, are things that probably don't affect your quality of your education very much. But they do affect students when you go looking at colleges to make a choice. You're not really looking at how strong the, you know, anthropology department is. You're looking at how nice the dorms are and, you know, where is the gym and things like that. So it's a complicated question. But so we need to do something about the price of college. And very importantly, these sticker prices that how fast they go up, that's not the prices, you know, the price that most students pay because there's so much financial aid out there. Complicated pricing system. But I think that the student debt issue has got to be, I mean, it's linked to prices. And no, is it because of student loans are available? Long history of people trying to do research on the relationship between student aid and college prices. And by and large, the evidence is that at the for-profit institutions, for sure, because when Pell Grants go up or loans go up, they have raised their tuition. They have to get some of their money not from federal student aid.
Yeah, the law
right?
requires them to. So for-profit institutions are required by law to increase their tuition when federal student aid goes up. Nonprofits are not. So there is a difference there, and it's a problem.
So, and I mean, it's just not, I mean, if you look at the share at the most expensive colleges, the share of students who are getting federal student aid, even the share of students who are borrowing, this is not the key factor that is driving the prices up.
So Diana, as we think about potentially coupling student loan forgiveness with reforms to how we finance higher education, and by the way, a lot of these questions are coming from people and they registered, so thank you for providing the questions. I edit them a little bit and figure out the sequence, but one of the questions is, what are some systemic changes that we can make to create a more equitable and sustainable model for financing higher education?
So one of the problems is Congress gets into the minutia of financial aid. So Congress dictates in the Higher Ed Act with great deals of specificity, interest rates, origination fees. The problem is Congress hasn't reauthorized the Higher Ed Act since I was the assistant secretary in 2007. It's actually in 2008 when they finished it. So you get these little piecemeal things and appropriations bills, but you know, as long as Congress is going to write the rules, they got to do their job and pass laws. And when they're not going to do it, you can't keep pace. So one of the reforms is get Congress out of it. Maybe turn FSA, federal student aid, into you know, a revolving fund, a separate entity run by a board of people who know how to run banks and know how to do financing. So I think that's one of the problems. You know, students have to be able to refinance loans in the federal program. I think that would make a huge deal. And I think we've got to tackle this interest rate issue. I mean, it's highway robbery. Plus loans are 8%, student loans are 5%. You know, you're taking the most vulnerable people with the lowest amount of assets and basically saying, borrow more, we want you to pay for health insurance for other people. So I think attacking the interest rate, but certainly forgiving, and I wouldn't be against forgiving some of the interest, but if you forgive principal, it does nothing to change the program. It does nothing to change borrower. You know, it's payday for a small group. I mean, not such a small group of people, but Sandy's right. It doesn't do anything about getting more people to or through college. So yeah, I think you can't forgive the loans without a fundamental reboot. And I just don't have any hope for that fundamental reboot.
So I think, I mean, what's really important is that college, it's expensive to educate people. Somebody has to pay for it, right? So the real question is who pays for it and when do they pay for it? If you come from a lower moderate income family, you don't have any money to put on the table right now, and we need to give you generous grant aid to make it possible and for you to see that it's possible to pay. So we could do more to help people pay up front. But it's also totally reasonable to borrow for college. The idea that no one should borrow doesn't make any sense. I mean, it's an investment in yourself. It pays off really well. We need insurance for the people for whom it doesn't pay off, but we need to restructure the loan program in a number of ways. I mean, if you look at what happens in some other countries where, you know, all of your loans it's automatically based on your income. It's collected through the tax system. People are much less aware of it. It's like an increase in your taxes. And they're not having big protests about forgiving the student
And you
debt.
don't accrue interest.
And so, well, yeah, I
Doing
mean,
their
and
taxes.
you wouldn't even, in capping interest, if the loans, by the way, when you borrow, it has a fixed interest rate on it. The rate changes every year depending on the market. But if it were variable and changed with the market, you wouldn't have to refinance and interest rates go way down. Your interest rate would go down too, which now it doesn't. And that's a problem.
And by the way, when I took my student loans, the rate was 9.5%, and we thought of that as free money. My first mortgage in 1988 was at 15.7%, and that was a FHA, like low-income person mortgage. The world was different.
But so what do you think are some of the long-term consequences of this burgeoning student loan debt for young people? So again, we see the statistics on home ownership, on household formation, on kids living with their parents longer. What do you think about the argument that some of why millennials are holding off on family formation and having children is because of some of the burden that these loans are generating?
That evidence is very weak. I mean, there are all kinds of things going on. If you want to know why young people don't buy houses, think about that the housing market crashed and a lot of people got into a lot of trouble and people said, I don't want to do that, right? Think about what has happened to home prices. Think about, you know, people moving from one place to another. Think about the fact that they're getting married and having children later, so they want to buy houses later. You have to be really careful looking at the research on the impact of student debt because it's very hard to counterfactual. There are articles that say, look, here are people who borrowed for college and people who didn't. They all have a bachelor's degree. Let's see who saves more money, the people who have debt or the people who don't. Well, obviously, if you have debt and you're paying it back, you're worse off. We'd all like to have somebody else give us the money so we don't have to pay. People with parents who can pay for their college don't have to borrow, and they also get help buying a house, by the way. So a lot of these studies are just not a reasonable comparison. We know you're better off if you have the same education, but you didn't have to borrow. The question is, what if you didn't borrow the money and therefore you didn't go to college or you didn't get the same education? And probably you'd be worse off and less likely to own a home. So these studies are really, really difficult, and the evidence is very shaky to suggest a direct connection between I went to college and borrowed money, and that's why my life is miserable.
I agree. I mean, I think there's so many issues around home ownership, and I think a lot of millennials live at home because mom and dad have a nice house and there's a pool in the back and they do your laundry. So I agree with Sandy. It's very, very complicated. My concern is that the gap between rich and poor is just getting wider and wider. You know, the rich kids whose parents are writing checks, probably sent them to private high school, you know, paid for them to be the star athlete, got the private coach. Those kids are so incredibly advantaged in every way, including admissions. And the low-income kid who's working 15 hours a week at McDonald's, just trying to help pay the bills, you know, usually cannot get into the colleges that are more generous. I worked at Princeton, I saw it all the time, you know, the 5 low-income students that they handpicked got great aid. You know, so the gap is just growing, and I just think, I don't know if people, I don't know if my kids could do what I did, because it's so much more expensive to do it, right? In my day, I'm 60. In my day, lots of us were first generation students. Lots of us could work our way through taking small loans. I don't know that somebody can do that now. And in my mind, that's the rub, is I don't know if truly low income students can do it. And we see that they have very low completion rates, because guess what? If you're low income, people say, oh, the college should add more services so you graduate. I taught at a community college. People drop out of college because their boss told them they could have Tuesday and Thursday off for school, but then somebody else quit, and all of a sudden now they're on the schedule for Tuesday, Thursday. Or their daycare stopped providing daycare, or they needed to have their car repaired and they can't afford it. Or what used to be 2 buses to get from home to campus is now 3 buses. So it's not because the student services aren't there. It's because life is really complicated when you're low income. And I just think that some of the, I don't know what the answer is. I don't have any answers. I wish I did. I don't. But I am really, really worried about the gap that it's driving. And I'll tell you, when I worked at Princeton, it made me sick. It literally made me sick. They only had $13 billion in their endowment at the time. It's now 30. They set the standards by which every other college must live. When I was there, they were upset that Harvard and Yale had higher yield than they did, and they surveyed students, why did you pick Harvard and Yale instead of Princeton? And the answer was, at Princeton, there weren't dorms for juniors and seniors. You had to join an eating club, and that's where you lived and ate. Most of the people who chose Harvard or Yale over Princeton said, I don't like the eating clubs. I don't like that. It's like a fraternity. So what did Princeton do? They got a huge amount of money from the person who started eBay, whose name shall not be said, and they built a 5-star hotel and called it a dorm and hired a 5-star chef. And the problem is, people who go to Princeton can't afford that. And Princeton can afford that. But Princeton then buys product placement in a movie, and everybody thinks college should be what Princeton is, which means that University of Maryland has to keep up because you want to compete for the same students. And so I really resent how the elite schools have set the standard that really hurts people and schools that are not in the game. And you know, they have so much money. And it's true, they grab 5 low-income students and pat themselves on the back.
So when we think about the students that are most acutely impacted by kind of the hardship that arises from this, what are some suggestions that you would have for better targeting some of the forgiveness efforts? So how might we make sure that it goes to those who truly need it, relative to some of the more broader forgiveness proposals that are out there?
So there are certainly groups of students that it has been very appropriate to forgive their student debt. I mean, people who are permanently disabled, I mean, why do we even have to have a conversation about that, right? People who were defrauded by their schools, unfortunately, like too many people to whom that has happened, and they, under false pretenses, went to the school, they graduated school, they're old people.
Like Rutgers University's business school.
Have not been served well by their institutions, and that's an issue. There are also, I mean, the income-driven repayment plans, the way you should be repaying your federal loans is that you don't pay if you're unemployed, you don't pay until your income is above a certain level, and then after 20 years or 25 years, your debt will be forgiven. That makes total sense. If you can't afford it after all that time, then okay, we should forgive it. And again, as I said before, just borrowed a little bit of money, we shouldn't make you wait that long. So there are people whose circumstances mean that they shouldn't pay. But the whole point of this payment system is that maybe the first few years after college, you're not earning much money. That's a timing problem. We shouldn't then forgive your debt just because you're not making much money for 2 years. Let's postpone it. And then if after, 10 or 15 or 20 years, you're not making money still, then we can forgive it. But if you just take an income level now, if you said today we're going to forgive the debt for everybody who makes less than $40,000 a year, all those people who just graduated from college, boom, they're done with their debt, right? Because they're not making that much money.
School residents.
So,
Right,
yeah,
or the
yeah,
people
medical
who
school
chose
residents,
to not
all kinds of
work.
people. It's got to be you got to look at it the long-term picture. We should not allow people to struggle for years and years and years and have student debt ruin their lives. And that does happen to some people, but that doesn't mean that it's a blanket problem for everybody.
I mean, I think if we capped, if we did it like they do it in Australia or Scandinavian countries where, you can take more years to pay it back if you have lower earnings. But, we're going to cap how much you pay so that you're not, penalized over and over and over. But here's the other problem with income-driven repayment. I'll tell you a little secret. The Department of Education has no way of verifying the reported income or family size of people who apply for income-driven repayment. And what we found is that there were lots of people lying, either themselves or there are all these third-party companies out there. They'll call you and say, for $300, I will make sure that you get into this income-driven repayment program. And the way they do it is they submit an application on your behalf and they lie about how many children you have or what your income is. And, you know, there were people who claimed having 99 children so they could get down to a $0 payment. The department has no way of confirming this. It would cost millions of dollars. And so that's the other thing, is like close the loophole and find a way to make sure that it's really going to the people who truly do have low income and 7 kids.
Well, this is where I think, Sandy, you mentioned, for instance, why are student loan payments, if we're gonna move towards an income-driven repayment approach, why isn't that handled coincident with filing your federal income taxes? So it seems like the Department of Treasury, and I'm biased here, is gonna be a much more efficient collector than the Department of Education. They're actually set up to track income and collect debts. Why is this housed at the
Yeah.
Department of Education?
I mean, it really should be that way.
It should
It's
be.
surprising how much disagreement there is about it. I mean, I feel like there are periods of time when, you know, like the advocacy community says, we really have to do this, people write about why we have to do it. And there's always somebody who says, well, for example, if it were withheld from your paycheck, then what if you needed the money for something else? You wouldn't have that option. In other words, if it comes out directly, it becomes a priority. You got to pay this loan back to the federal government, right? But what if you wanted to do something? I mean, it could be, what if you had, you'd want to have some provision for if you have terrible medical problems or whatever, and you really can't afford to make your payments. There should be some appeal process, but it has a lot to do with people thinking that I have all these other things that I want to do or have to do. Student loans are the last priority. And I think people think of it that way very frequently, that what people can't afford is their student debt. They don't think, oh, but they can't afford their car loan. They can't afford, you know, whatever other, the size of their mortgage. They think it's their student loan that's the marginal thing putting them across the
Because you're
line.
paying debt on something that you experienced in the past, right? You know, you're 50 years old and you're still paying for that fancy gym that you lost access to 35 years ago or whatever. You know, so I do think that the repayment program should be at Treasury. Absolutely, you know, it should be there. I had another thought was,
Well, I want to make sure.
bankruptcy. Can I
Yeah.
mention
That's where I was gonna go next.
I do think, and we actually tried to do this in the Trump administration, and so is the Biden administration, trying to ease a little bit so that people, the way you really help the people who are in desperate straits is through bankruptcy, right? It's not easy to declare bankruptcy, but people have to do it. And, you know, maybe that is the way you get there, is because, you know, bankruptcy courts are better at looking at somebody's total financial picture and deciding who really needs relief. Maybe it shouldn't be so hard to have that debt.
I totally agree that it should be easier to discharge your student loans. Why can you discharge your other debt more easily than your student loans? But this is not the solution, because bankruptcy is really awful.
It
And
is
there
awful.
has to be a solution that means that we can ease the problems of people having difficulty with student loans without them having to declare bankruptcy.
Yeah.
So I want to make sure there's an opportunity to open it up for people in the audience, but one of the questions that we were submitted that I want to also make sure we have time to get to is about the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program. So I'm just going to read the question. This program was created to provide relief for public sector workers such as teachers, nurses, and government employees who dedicate their careers to serving our communities. However, the program has been plagued by complex requirements, poor communication, and a staggeringly high rejection rate, with only 2.1% of applications being approved as of November 2020, according to a GAO report. A 2019 survey by the American Federation of Teachers found that 80% of borrowers who had applied for PSLF were rejected, often due to technicalities or poor guidance from loan servicers. What can we do to improve the PSLF program?
Can I answer that one? Because I was the assistant secretary when John Sarbanes created public service loan forgiveness. And I went up to the Hill and I told him, don't do it. You are going to screw over most borrowers. And the answer I got was, we want to be able to tell people we're giving them this benefit, but it's got to cost a very small amount. So here's what they did. They made public service loan forgiveness available only to people who borrowed in the direct loan program, which at the time was 20% of borrowers, and the school, not the borrower, decided which program to borrow from. by limiting it to people in the direct loan program, they got the score, the cost of the program way down because they knew so few people would be eligible. I was the assistant secretary when we regulated on that program, and I made it possible for people to consolidate into the direct loan program so they would be eligible. The subsequent administration, who probably just hadn't been as engaged as we were, did not keep telling people, if you want this program, you have to consolidate into the direct loan program. People got to the end of their 10 years and exactly what I told people on the Hill was going to happen, happened. All these people were like, why isn't my loan being forgiven? We went back to the Hill and told them how to fix the program. And the response from Congress was, we can't afford to do that. So we're just going to fix it for a few people. And then we're going to claim that it's all fixed and blame you for what doesn't work. This is a budgeting gimmick on the part of Congress. That program worked exactly as Congress designed it. The other thing is, it was supposed to be there to help. So when the direct loan program was 20% of the borrowers, it was at schools that served very low income students, less selective schools, and many of those graduates did go to work for social services agencies. Made total sense to forgive their loans. Now you look at the list, special interest groups are the ones that are benefiting, right? I mean, you can work at lots of politically motivated organizations. I don't care if it's Heritage, Urban, AEI. It's not just social service agencies. It's people that work for very well-funded nonprofits who are making six-figure incomes. And so, you know, and by the way, we all learned in COVID, who kept their job and kept their money without having to go to work? Federal workers, state workers, public workers. So, you know, there's a difference between a social service and a public service. But my big concern is, why should somebody who works at Urban Institute, a great place to work, and makes a six-figure income qualify for loan forgiveness, but a nurse who works at a private hospital and makes no more than a nurse who works at a public hospital isn't eligible?
So this program is obviously a mess and needs to be fixed,
Yeah.
but, and I will confess that many years ago, when Elizabeth Warren was a law professor, co-authored with her an article about how we needed a public service loan forgiveness program. But that was before we had income-driven repayment. If we fix the income-driven repayment program, then when you have a low income, that's what's going to cause you to get your debt forgiven. The idea that we're going to pick which occupations and which employers, it's going to inevitably be a mess. It should be based on your income.
Yep.
Let me open it up to the audience. So if you want to come to the microphones and ask your question, please come on down.
Hi, thank you for coming in today. You mentioned that in the 90s, higher education was industrialized, a change that turned students into a commodity for public institutions. Has this development devalued higher education for students who are no longer practicing scholarship, but rather just being fed corporate propaganda while also graduating in a debt trap, forcing us into corporate jobs?
So you know, look, I think colleges and universities are doing a good job, right? I think they do serve their students. I think the problem is that the beast can never be fed well enough. And I think what happened in the 90s is, a real pivot toward, low selectivity, open enrollment, bringing in people who don't have the skills to be successful, but the colleges were still getting tuition. It happened at the for-profits, it happened at community colleges, it happened at less selective four-year publics. And so I think the industrial, it's an entitlement program, right? I mean, it's like Medicaid and Medicare. Once there's an entitlement program, an industry will grow up to absorb those funds. So, I think that, this is a flagship institution. It's a selective institution. I think they do a great job, and I think they do care about serving you and making sure that you leave better than you came. But the industrial part of it is that a whole lot of people are being sucked into the system who would be better served by an apprenticeship, who would be better served by waiting a few years. And that's the concern I have.
So Sandy, before you add on to that, let me supplement the question by saying, there have been some proposals, for instance, that ask the colleges and universities that have abnormally high default rates to perhaps share in the cost of forgiveness. What are your thoughts on that? In addition, anything you might want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a real problem that, I mean, the for-profit sector grew a lot, it has shrunk. There are some very good for-profit institutions, there's some very terrible nonprofit institutions, but there is a real gap between, in general, the performance of those institutions and the nonprofit institutions. And in particular, default rates are incredibly high. Students borrow much more money and they default at high rates. And yeah, there should be some incentive for your students not to default. It should include Parent Plus loans, of course. And we have to measure default in an effective way. It's not that easy to design a good system, because what you don't want to do is discourage institutions from taking students who are at risk of not graduating. I mean, I totally agree with you that there are people who shouldn't be going to college, and the idea that everybody should go to college no matter what their preferences and capacities are doesn't make sense. But certainly many people who have far less than 100% chance of graduating should be trying college. And we don't want everybody to graduate, because you can't make that prediction, and we want to give everybody who can benefit the opportunity. But I think, yes, it would be very helpful if there were some risk. And I think that it's hard, because we keep talking about college as something monolithic, and to say colleges are doing this or that just doesn't make sense. There's such a wide range of institutions in our country, and they educate different students, they have different programs, they have different resources, and any generalization that you make is likely to be wrong.
And we know that defaults are, highly linked to socioeconomic status and race. And that's because the way that most students stay out of default in the early years is their parents are paying their loans back. And so if you're a minority or low income, your mommy and daddy are not doing it. So I think I used to feel like it would be awful to have schools contribute, because then they would stop enrolling high-risk students. And now I've kind of come full circle to think maybe it'd be better if those students were served in a different way, right? Maybe you don't want to take opportunity, but if people can't succeed, then stop telling them they have to go to college and start valuing apprenticeship and other pathways. So, I agree with you, but if we go there, we're going to be left with only selective institutions, and maybe that's okay. And then, for God's sake, and this comes from a paper you wrote, don't let community colleges graduate people with degrees in liberal arts or general studies unless they're in the honors program. So I think if community colleges did a better job at vocational training, we would solve a lot of these problems.
Other questions from the audience, please.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. You criticized about the school investment in tangible and intangible asset, and also endowment of university. I participate in one of our school's endowments, and that secured me a great job. Also, if we think about those investments correlated with higher ranking for a university, probably that higher ranking makes more companies to come in our schools and gives us more opportunity to better job, high paying job than other schools. So if we think about that part, probably I prefer to pay $15,000 more next year than having lower ranking and no great companies come to my university. What do you think about that?
There's no doubt that ranking really helps people who can get into those schools. No doubt about it. The problem is that there are a lot of really smart, talented people who were socioeconomically disadvantaged growing up, went to a crappy high school, had to work at McDonald's, couldn't be in the school band or whatever. They can't get into those schools. So they are further disadvantaged when, the star belly sneeches, they don't have the star upon theirs, they are completely excluded from the best jobs because they couldn't get into those ranked schools. So I once made a comment, and Sandy disagrees with me, but I once said, I think the biggest problem in the program is every university should have been required to admit a certain proportion of students by lottery. You can even set minimum requirements, because until you do that, rich kids are always going to have an advantage to get into the more selective, which is not to say that every one of you is a rich kid. I'm not saying that, but more affluent students have more choice. They get into the system, they get funneled to the better jobs. And there's just something about that that really bothers me, perhaps because I was on the losing end of that for most of my life, so I'm sensitive to it.
So let me just say about that. My husband and I recently wrote a book called Can College Level the Playing Field? And the question is, can you sort of blame colleges for not being able to take random groups of people and bring them up to the level where it doesn't matter where you started, all you have to do is go to a great college for 4 years and you'll be fine. And the problem is we have such an unequal society to start with. People have such unequal, healthcare and early childhood education and K-12 education and neighborhoods and schools, that by the time they're 18 years old, they have no way to catch up to the people who grew up in these very different environments. And colleges can certainly help and can certainly do more, but they can't solve that problem. And the solution isn't to say, if you're in a position to benefit from it, you shouldn't go to a great college. The solution is to do something so that we don't have such dramatic, as you said, such dramatic inequality to start with. But it's not that you would want to advise any individual student to not go to the best college that they can get into, because it's not just the job you're going to get, it's the education you're going to get and the opportunities you're going to have.
And the network, I swear.
And that you're going to be more likely to graduate.
50% of it is you get into a network of people that are going to help you get a good job. At the community college where I taught, 50,000 students, 2 career services professionals.
Please.
Thank you so much for coming out. It was really insightful to hear from all 3 of you. Obviously, a student loan is a loan against the taxpayer. We ought to be moving towards a point where we have to forgive as little loans as possible. Recently, throughout the presidential primaries, Department of Education, both sides have come under intense scrutiny as to its role, its purpose, and its effectiveness in helping students first. And as for putting students first, how does the Department of Education see itself in the future for ensuring that colleges stop selling a false lifestyle, which often translates into accruing more classes, more credits than one can afford, and by way of getting involved at college orientations? So to put some paint to that, during orientation, showing, parents and students alike, this is how much you're going to be able to take from a bank. This is how much you're going to take from your FAFSA, your free application. And this is how much you're going to be able to get from Pell Grants, and put that in a very coherent, clear format so that, before even classes start, parents, students know in advance, this is the total cost of attendance. This is how much interest I'm going to be accruing after the fact. And maybe, educating them more and putting them in the driver's seat for, you might want to do computer science, I'm a computer science major, but you might not be able to afford college the way that you originally thought. Maybe there's some alternative routes to get you where you need to go to, again, from generation to generation, increase generational wealth.
So hopefully the Department of Education, it can't regulate how much colleges charge. No way, no how. The Department of Ed actually has very little control. I mean, well, first of all, I don't know if I can say this out loud, but it's a total shit show over there. So let's just be honest. But beyond that, they really have very few levers, because Congress writes all the rules about financial aid, and that's the only lever that you really have. What we did is we at least put in place a form that students would have to go in every year and sign off that they knew what their cumulative debt was, what their current payment would be. And we put a new financial aid sheet together that we wanted colleges to use that very clearly delineated grant aid and loan aid. And honestly, and we expanded the college scorecard to give much more information about earnings. But a computer science student might go and look at that. The average student isn't going to look at that. The average student can't be a computer science major. So, we tried to expand the data, but what the Department of Ed can't do, Department of Labor tried, we can't provide people for whom college isn't the right choice. I have a son for whom college was not the right choice. So I'm not talking about other people's kids. The government, the society has done nothing. It was harder for my son to get into an apprenticeship program than it was to get into an elite college. He went to 1 year and he hated it. So until we can provide viable options to college, I don't know what we can do, but but the Department of Ed, like I said, information is the only tool it has. Most students don't know how to use the information.
Okay, all right. We've hit the 7:30 mark, so let me take this opportunity to thank our guests for coming this day. Very